The Chet Curtis Report.
Welcome back. My guest tonight is one of the best-known professors and political activists in the world. There's seemingly no subject, domestic or international, on which Noam Chomsky has not weighed in on. The New York Times has called him arguably the most important intellectual alive. Make no mistake about it, he is opinionated, but as it has been said, opinions are what make people so interesting. And that's why we invited him here tonight. Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at MIT. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Let's start a little bit with current events. There's a million things I'd love to ask you about, but one of the things that surprised me post-hurricanes Katrina and Rita was the apparent realization for the first time by many people that there were a lot of poor people who lived in the South, in New Orleans, in Mississippi, and Alabama.
And in Boston. The United States has one of the highest poverty rates of the industrial countries, actually maybe the highest. And it's gone up in the last several years steadily. It's close to 13% now. New Orleans was very high. It was about 28% below the poverty line. And the poverty line is a very arbitrary measure. It was actually set up in the 1960s, and by now it's almost meaningless with the changes in purchasing needs and power.
Yeah, what's to blame for it? Is it the media, or is it just the the notion that you want to ignore bad news? Or
well, I mean, it's easy to ignore bad news, but the blame for it is pretty well understood. I mean, take a look at the latest UN Human Development Report. Just came out a couple of months ago. They review the situation in the United States and in other countries, in England, and point out that social policy in the United States has kept poverty unusually high. Then they look at England, and it's very striking. In England, during the Thatcher years, child poverty started to go way up, and it kind of leveled off. In the last few years, it's been going down, and the reason simply is a change in social policy, directing more funds to the needs of the poor, and child poverty has indeed declined. England was as bad as the United States or worse. Now it's improved. These are questions of choice of social policy.
But we've spent billions of dollars on poverty in this country.
No, we haven't.
Where does that money go?
There isn't that much of it, and it hasn't been. We do not spend that kind of money on poverty. Our social benefits programs, by comparison with other industrial countries, are quite poor. And in fact, if the United States has just been through an unusual, I think, unique period of American economic history, and we've been through about a 25-year period or more, in which for the majority of the population, real wages have stagnated or declined. People are maintaining family incomes only by increasing workloads well beyond other industrial countries by now, and benefits have also declined. Well, you know, that has its effects. It has its effects on all sorts of things. Just name them. Poverty is just a measure of one of them.
Yeah, I've heard you in speeches and read some interviews where in your criticism of the United States, particularly our foreign policy, things that have happened over the years, you say, you know, should be front page news, should be on the television, newscasts every day, every evening, and yet they're not. I mean, I don't understand why you think that is. Is it some conspiracy on the part of the news organizations?
It's not a conspiracy. I mean, I've written a lot about this, but one thing that I've pointed out is that the media aren't that different from the general intellectual culture, scholarship, journals.
So why don't they emphasize
Because they reflect the interests of, they reflect a fairly narrow sector of elite interests. I mean, why does every newspaper, say, have a business section and no newspaper have a labor section? I mean, it's a lot more people who are workers than who are corporate executives. I mean, the entire system is oriented towards the needs and concerns of sectors that in fact amass wealth and power. It's an unfortunate situation, but it's not obscure. I mean, take the media. What are they, after all? Overwhelmingly, the media are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates linked to one another, closely linked to government. The people who make it into the media came through the same kind of education you and I did. It's an education which trains you to be part of the kind of managerial class, whether it's ideological management, which is kind of what teaching in media are, or economic management or political management. It's a small group which happens to have overwhelming influence. It's a real serious weakness of American society. In fact, there's a name for it. It's called democratic deficit. Democratic deficit means a system in which formal democratic institutions exist, but they function only in a very limited way. And we see that very clearly. So here's something that should have been reported in the front pages, and as far as I could tell, was never reported anywhere. The federal budget came out a couple of months ago, February. Shortly after it, a major study was carried out of people's attitudes toward the federal budget. They were diametrically opposed to the budget in just about every respect. I could go through the details, but the basic point is that where the budget spending was increased, the majority of the population wanted it decreased. Where it was being decreased, the large majority wanted it increased. Now, I don't think that was reported in a single newspaper in the country. It's a democratic society. That's very important.
So what do we do about that? I mean, no private citizen is going to wade through, thousands of pages.
I had to find this. You have to do an individual research project to find these things out. No one has the time for it, the resources, knows where to look, and so on.
Yeah.
That's a real flaw, and it requires organized popular movements which simply insist on sustaining, and in many ways regaining, their democratic rights. It doesn't happen